Good morning, everybody. We've got obviously a big week here on Talking Tennis. We're in episode 2, I think, of Roger Federer Week, and we're looking at his French Open run. What are your broad memories, Jack, of Federer and the French Open?
Straight in, yeah. Federer, the one takeaway for me as somebody who likes to sort of cling on to little stats and stuff like that is that Federer is probably one of the greatest clay court players of all time, and it sometimes gets forgotten in his accolades and such. Obviously, I think Rafa eclipsed that, and he did lose to Rafa like 6 times, I think, at the French Open. So people need to remember that he's a great clay courter, and watching him on clay was different as well. It was like that the Roger Federer experience on every other surface, but on clay he was very interesting. He came up with shots again people hadn't seen because he had to. He was hampered on clay every time he played somebody like Rafa.
Yeah. I mean, he just seemed more vulnerable, put it that way. I mean, the results speak for themselves. Nick, do you have any broad memories of either Federer at the French Open or just on clay in general?
Yeah, I think my memories of Federer at the French were, I mean, look, he was brilliant everywhere. Was he more vulnerable? Maybe. I think maybe later in his career. But definitely the French Open, if you're a Federer fan, was very skillful at points in the 2010s because he didn't really show. He started to stop showing up that much. But my memories of the French Open would be Federer would always seem to run into some kind of trouble when he really got tested by particularly Rafael Nadal. It was still great to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just expand maybe a little bit more on my point about him being more vulnerable there. He just didn't have the air of superiority that he had elsewhere. When I did make a note last night that the gap between Rafa by 2008, and we will obviously be addressing that final. By 2008, the gap between Rafa and Federer was arguably greater than the gap between Federer and the rest. So we had obviously a huge gap between Federer and the rest in general on all surfaces, and even at the French Open, I would say. But now the gap between Federer and Nadal was growing too, despite obviously what was to come in 2009. But we'll address that very shortly. Yeah, there is a slight delay, Nick. Don't worry about that. See if hopefully, if it becomes an issue, we can switch devices. That was obviously a thing. But let's just go through his French Open record, so to speak. It went back to, I think, 1999. Oh, by the way, he only ever got bageled 3 times in slams, and 2 of them occurred at the French Open. And the first of which was against Pat Rafter. Pat Rafter bagels him, I think, in 99.
That might have been his first slam appearance, right? Because I think he debuted at the French Open.
Did he really? Okay, so that might well be the case. Yeah, let's race through this. Yeah, so there we go. Lost in the first round to Pat Rafter in 1999, and one of those sets was a bagel. I think he got bageled 6 times in his entire career, but the only 3 times at slams. Once was on grass, actually, believe it or not. I think, and he never got bageled on a hard court. Never got bageled on a hard court at all in his career.
That's very surprising. That's actually crazy.
Yeah. I was checking this last night as well. Okay, so if we just go through these sort of early years, if you like, you can see he's not really, but it was the same, to be honest with you, in Australia. It took him 3 or 4 years before he got to his final. I think it was in 2004. Obviously, Wimbledon, the breakthrough year was 2001, which interestingly, that year he played Corretja, obviously a former French Open winner. And he fell to him in the quarterfinals. But you can see he's gradually sort of making some nice progress during these years. Go on, Jack.
Former finalist, pretty sure. Yeah.
Oh, just a finalist, was he, Corretja?
Just finalist, yeah. I think he lost to Querten.
Oh, okay. Gustavo Querten from Brazil, right.
Moya. Okay. He lost to Moya in 98. He might have also lost, 2-time finalist. Moya in 98, Querten in 2001.
Okay, right. So did Corretja never win a slam?
No.
No, he won the tour finals, but he never won a slam.
Okay. Pity. Anyway, a nice guy. Well, I mean, I took a selfie with him once. That's how I know him. Still nice guy. He gets the nice guy for now. Although he did have a backward step in 2002 and 2003 with 2 first-round defeats there that we can see. He does play Gustavo Kuerten, who obviously was a bit of a legend in France. I mean, not too many Brazilians spring to mind as being slam winners. Maybe he's the only one on the men's side. Anyway, I don't remember any others off the top of my head.
Yeah,
and he lost to... Go on, sorry.
Yes, just confirming.
Yeah. So no, that's fine. Jump in, especially when I'm saying things. I'm giving Korecha Grand Slams that he never won. So definitely pick me up on that. But really, I guess the main meat of the Federer French Open narrative really is from, say, 05 to about 2012, something like that, because he's there or thereabouts. And of course, by 04, he's already a double Grand Slam winner. He's obviously won the previous 2. He's won 2 of the previous 3, with Wimbledon in 2003 and then Australian Open in 2004 being his second major. Seems like a long time ago. Well, it is almost 20 years ago. And 2004, he goes out to Kuerten, but then the following year, 2005, is when he gets to his first final, where he comes across a certain Rafael Nadal. Nadal does find it a bit more difficult against him than he did against many of his other opponents, and it's in 4 sets. And we do see a similar narrative with Nadal and Federer at the 3 slams. What do I mean? At Wimbledon, the gap between Federer and Nadal was like this, but it's Federer who's ahead and it's Nadal who's behind. And over the years, the gap gets closer and closer before Rafa ends up overtaking him. Same on a hard court to some extent. I mean, their first 2 matches were shared on a hard court. I think they were both in Miami, actually, and it was one. In fact, going into this final, they'd only played each other twice. Both had been in Miami, and it was one match all in the exchange. But again, by 2009, Nadal had reeled Federer in, if you like, in terms of any potential gap there was on the hard court, and he obviously goes and beats him in Australia. And we'll be talking about that rivalry later on in the week. But do you have any memories, either of you, regarding this 2005 final?
I just pointing to Nick there. It's okay. I'll go. 2005. Yeah, a fair while ago. I wasn't quite watching tennis regularly, but I mean, I've seen highlights before. Again, he kept it incredibly competitive, and it was one of those ones you think, I mean, the guy could have maybe won, but at the same time, we've seen Rafa pull off now 7, I think, different wins actually. No, six wins. That's right. Six wins against
Federer.
Federer at the French Open, yeah, and every time he's managed to come through. So, did he really have a chance? You kind of feel like Nadal at sort of 70% would have beaten Federer at Roland Garros every time, because of course it's Nadal at Roland Garros, right? But it's maybe one of the only chances he had to actually beat him.
Yeah, I sent you both a message last night with the sort of highlights of this match, because I do think the aura wasn't there with Federer, with Nadal at this point. So although other matches went to 4 sets and appeared tight at various times, there was never this, with the other matches that were to come, the feeling as a viewer, at least, and I dare say on court too, was like, this is still going to be Nadal's. Even if he's threatening in the second or third set, this is still going to be, because the aura had been built by 06, 07. It was already building. I mean, we've already got the aura of just unbelievability now, but the aura was beginning to build, particularly on clay. But as I said to you as well, that Nadal was sort of starting to eat into any advantage he had on other surfaces too. So I said to you in a private chat last night, I said, this was the one. This was the one where he could have beaten Nadal and he could have gone on. And I sort of watched this game, the highlights at least, quite closely last night. And we did see, and again, it's a bit about the vulnerability, Nick. What I mean is, I saw him more frustrated than anywhere in any other situation before. His shrieks of frustration seem to be louder than anywhere else. I don't know whether it's the Philippe Chatrier court, whether the echo occurs there or anything like this. But his shrieks of joy as well, by the way, seem to be bigger at the French Open as the years went by. But this Nadal rivalry, Nick, on clay and at the French Open, what were your thoughts on this sort of emergence of the Spaniard, if you like?
Yeah, I think, well, with that 2005 match, there's also, it's not just the aura of Nadal. I think it was also far less scar tissue for Federer. They'd only played twice up before then, I think. And they were both in Miami. One of them was that 5-set Miami final, one of the 6 5-set matches. But Federer won it. And the first time they ever played, Nadal won, but down to Federer. But it's not his career as you've been before, John, where Nadal was in Federer's head. And I think that's one of the reasons why maybe it was also a bit more winnable. In terms of, the rivalry was, I agree with you. As it went on, it sort of felt more and more like Nadal was unbeatable at the French Open, and he is unbeatable at the French Open. He's only ever lost match point there 3 times, including to Novak Djokovic. And that's late, and they were later in his career. So I think as a Federer fan, I'm willing to give Nadal that he's just unstoppable when he's on Philippe Chatrier court. And as his career developed, he became even more unstoppable because, let's face it, Nadal from 2005 to 2007 wasn't at his peak yet. And he was still dominant on clay. And it's no surprise that as his career developed, the gap to Federer closed.
I'm going to just take us through the 2005 and 2006 matches just very quickly as I can. If, Jack, you have any thoughts on, to be honest with you, any of these 3 matches you can see on the screen, I'll come to you in a second about this spell, if you like. But just regarding that 2005 match, the first set goes to Nadal, and the second set, because it's a 4-set match, as you can see, the second set actually is Federer goes a double break up in the second set on Nadal, which I can't recall happening too often before at the French. I think he might have won another set at some point, 6-1, but we'll come to that shortly. But he does lose one of those breaks. Nevertheless, he does manage to hold out, but he is sort of hanging on in that second set and eventually manages to close it out. So then it's 1 set all, and the reason why I talk about it being the closest one of all is because it's 4-5 in the second set on serve. Okay. So I don't recall them being that close to the finish line, potentially 1 set away from winning. And Federer's there with Nadal. It's basically neck and neck. It's now 15-40 though in this third set. Sorry. So it's 4-5, 15-40 on the Federer serve. So he's facing 2-set points. And of course, with the aura that was built up in years to come, we'd probably just go, well, Rafa's going to win this set now and go on and win it in 4. Wasn't the case back then. Federer saves the 2-set points. However, he does end up breaking him after I think it's Rafa with a volleyed drive volley that he manages to win the point on advantage. And he ends up winning that set 6-4. No looking back. 2006. Roger would actually win the first set. And this is now the final, by the way. I mean, obviously, the semi-finals in 05. It's now in his first final at the French Open. And it's now like, okay, can you sort of get over the line now? Because it's now building to be a bit of a difficult tournament for him, shall we say. Because now he's on the board in terms of the majors. I think all 3 of them. I think he won his first US Open, I think was it 04 or 05, Jack?
His first, what Open, sorry?
US Open.
2004, yeah.
2004, yeah. So he's obviously on the board in terms of all the majors, but still the French Open is eluding him, and it'll continue to elude him, of course. And he wins the first set in 06. And there's an epic point, by the way, that I just want to highlight from this particular match, because there were epic points between Rafa and Federer at all the majors, of course, but even at the French too. And this is the first one, if you like, that I've got for my little highlight reel. It's during the 06 final. It's very close to Nadal winning it. As you can see, he's trying to serve out the match. 5-4 in the 4th and 30 all. So
Love
Federer
your
manages
point.
to not just get to 30-40, he actually goes on and breaks. So can you believe that? Rafa is serving for the match or the championship on Philippe Chatrier and doesn't close it out. But it then goes to a tie break and Rafa runs away with it quite easily. Or at least he goes up to 5-2 and then ultimately wins it 7-4. And the aura is building. Have you got any memories of those two matches, Jack, or any awareness of those two matches, should I say?
Yeah, it might have been the 2005 one when it was really close in the third. I'm sure Rafa had to recover from love 40 at one point. I'm
Okay,
pretty
may well have
sure.
done, yeah.
Yeah, similar to Medvedev. Of course, Medvedev, he was really on the precipice in Australia, but still, yeah, it's another one of those love 40 recoveries that you look back on, and it's kind of legendary, obviously, within the whole scheme of his French Open dominance. So he had chances. He had chances in both matches, and you can see from that clip there that he was playing shots that you wouldn't really expect anybody else to play as a one-handed backhands down the line, basically just to escape the jail of that horrible forehand, basically. And it was working because it's Federer and he can pull that stuff off, but there's only so much you can do, especially when you've got somebody who moves like Rafa on the other side of the net.
I think he also perhaps found a chink in the mental armor of Federer, perhaps. He chinked away at it. He created it, arguably, Rafa. And then, of course, also there's the backhand. You just highlighted that there with obviously an excellent backhand he did down the line. But it was something by the '08 Wimbledon final that people were starting to notice. Oh, hello. I think he's sort of found something that maybe other people had a feeling that could be there, but they just couldn't get to that position, particularly on grass. They were never in a position to pepper his backhand from the back of the court like Rafa could. Have you got any thoughts on that, just very briefly, because we're going to go into a deeper dive on that rivalry later in the week?
Yeah, of course, tons of thoughts on that. We're really going to flesh that out, aren't we? But it's the reason for people who don't know. That's what Rafa was able to do that other players couldn't do. So easily able to find Federer's backhand over and over again, almost barraging it, basically. Just the forehand, the lefty forehand in particular, was just so effective against him, and because of the control Nadal imparts on that shot, it's really not. I mean, we've seen matches where he looks like he's about 50%, and he's just rolling that forehand cross court. And people with weaker backhands will still lose to him, basically. It's not difficult for him to do. And obviously, when he's playing at the peak of his powers on clay, as well, with the spin, jumping off the court, it goes high to Roger's backhand. There's a ton of reasons why it's just pro Rafa through and through.
I saw a horrible. It wasn't a shank. It's worse than a shank, because a shank is just, for me, just sort of can happen and miss time, and especially if you haven't been on court for a while. But I saw a horrible backhand that he had to deal with. First, it was a horrible backhand to deal with. Just through some highlight reels last night at the French Open. It was a horrible backhand to deal with. But secondly, it bounced up so high. And it was just one of those, and Federer just couldn't deal with it, even at his height. Obviously, he's about 6'4", I think. I will come to you in a second, Nick. 2007 was one set all, so again, it seems close, but as I said, the aura was beginning to build now, and ends up being a 4-set win. And also, not only that, Nadal broke quite early in the 4th set, so any sort of nip and tuck feelings during that 4th set never really materialized like they had done the year before. Nick, have you got any thoughts on what we've been talking about so far?
No. Well, yes, I do, but they're kind of the same as you guys have been kind of sharing, because so if I was just to repeat it verbatim, it would be boring for the viewers. To say my point from earlier, it was definite sense that as Federer and Nadal played more and more, Nadal was the one who could bother Federer the most, especially during his sort of peak years from 2004 to 2007, arguably. So that by 2008, when Rafa was reaching his peak, Federer wasn't quite there anymore. And I think that the French Open, as Rafa got stronger, he was definitely able to pull the gap away. I think the reputation of their matches as they went on just felt more and more inevitable. 2005 and 2006 maybe could have gone Federer's way if some aspects had gone changed, particularly 2005. But The only issue with that is Nadal's never lost when it's gone 5 sets at Roland Garros, so we just don't know. Federer
No,
could have won an
but
extra
they never
set,
had a
and
5 sets, funny
you know
enough.
he's still
Yeah, they
no,
never had a 5 sets
no.
across these
Nadal's
two.
only ever gone 5 sets at Roland Garros 3 times with John Isner, Novak Djokovic, and Felix Auger-Aliassime.
Okay.
So, and he's won all of them. So
Yeah.
it's one of those what ifs we just don't know.
No, that's true. Of course, 2008 though, maybe the most. Would you say the most pain? No, not the most painful defeat of his career. I think I've heard him talk about the 2019 Wimbledon final probably being that. It might either him or it was his coach said it. And I think also Chris Clary, who wrote a book on him, obviously recently, was asked the same question. What do you think was the most painful? And also 2019 Wimbledon. But I guess the biggest sort of beating of Federer's career, I would say, was the 2008 final. Would you agree, Jack?
I think it literally is, yeah. I'm pretty sure he's never conceded less than 4 games in a 5-set match before, even back in the early days when he was just starting. But, you know, in a way, I did just talking about my opinion on if it hurts, I guess, or would hurt as a Federer fan. I mean, he lost like 3 finals on the bounce to, or he'd lost 3 matches on the bounce to Rafa at the French Open. And then, you know, this could have been 3 straight sets that were pretty close. Or it could have been 3 straight sets that ended up like this. And to be honest, it'd be the same result. Whereas Wimbledon, you know, I think a lot of people would have preferred he didn't have those match points in hindsight if they knew he was going to lose, right? So
yeah, right.
So
yeah.
I don't think it was that bad. It was just the culmination of years of beatings from Rafa, basically on clay, just coming to a head, I think.
Yeah, it was 6-1, 6-3, 6-love. And so it was one of those 3 occasions that he was happened to be bageled, as I highlighted earlier as well. He was bageled in the final set. I don't know if that makes him feel even more demolished. By the way, he was wearing a black outfit, and it seemed to mirror the sort of clouds and the gloom that were surrounding him. Hi, Jay. Nice to have you on board. It sort of did seem to sort of fit the narrative of the day, if you like. Funny enough, I mean, some years I remember Paris being searing sunshine. I remember some of the semi-final he had against Nadal had against Djokovic in about 2012, I think it was searing sunshine. But there could be some quite cloudy finals, I remember, in terms of the weather, where the rain would sort of seemingly threaten. But really, there was sort of one big cloud hanging over Federer. And he said he took that mood into the final in 2008 at Wimbledon too. He said that during the Strokes of Genius documentary, I hear him say that he felt the weirdness or the uncomfortability or just the sadness, if you like, from that French Open final. He took it into the first 2 sets that, of course, he lost to Rafa in 2008 at Wimbledon. Any other final points I've got from this? Not really. Do you have any thoughts on this match, particularly, Nick?
Yeah, 2000 match. 2008 hadn't been a great season for Federer in the first half of the year, really. He'd won 1 title in Estoril, I think. I think he won 1 title going into it. He'd just recovered from mononucleosis.
Yes.
I think that French Open final was kind of a lost straw. But I remember that match. I was 14 and I was a very big Federer fan. And so basically it got to the point when I was seeing Federer get beat down, I was just refusing to watch. So I don't remember the specifics of what happened in the match other than the scoreline. And I haven't gone back to rewatch it, but that's my riding memory of the 2008 final was Federer only won. Federer got bageled. Really? He shouldn't be getting bageled. This is ridiculous. And especially in light of I'd seen the 2007 final, the first time I'd seen Federer lose a match. And I remember my thoughts at the time being, oh no, this is even worse.
Yeah, Nick, you're just breaking up a little bit. Sorry. At this very crucial juncture, as I can see you deep in thought there. We've got a picture of you pointing at your head. But that's cool. That's fine. We got most of the message. Thanks there, Nick.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Thanks, Nick. Yeah, it was fine. We got you for 90%. It was just the last crucial moment as you were pointing at your head with some deep thought that we had you frozen, but no worries. So really, it's funny that a year later, the hallelujah moment occurs, if you like, bearing in mind how far, of course, it seemed like it seemed like the French Open was getting further away. He was getting to finals every year, as we saw 3 finals in a row there, but he was always running into Rafa Nadal, and the gap with Rafa on all surfaces, and none more so than clay, was widening, if you like, or it was narrowing perhaps on grass, and now it's widening on clay. So really, 2009, though, is interesting. He does beat Rafa on clay in 2009 in Madrid, which back then was the final tournament before the French Open. So now, of course, it's Rome, but I think back in those days, Rome preceded Madrid. Go on, sorry.
I think you're getting feedback maybe from Nick, possibly.
I'm
not
okay,
sure.
Yeah. Go on, Nick. Did you say something?
Nick's muted himself. No, it was just yourself coming through there, John. You
Oh,
were
right.
listening to your own voice.
All right, no worries. Let me know if that repeats as well, because I'll try and avoid that. Yeah, so by 2009, it seemed like further away than ever, but he did have a landmark victory against Rafa in Madrid, and that set him up quite nicely, I guess, to give him a bit more optimism going into the French Open. But of course, Rafa Nadal was still there to stand in his way. However, there was a 24-hour period where the tennis world shook, and possibly has only been shaken in a bigger way, possibly by the Federer retirement last week, and maybe the Djokovic incident at the US Open when he hits the ball against the line judge. I think that are the two that spring to mind in terms of just jarring shakes. Of course, there's been epic matches, etc., and so on and so forth, but the epic shake of the earthquake to hit tennis over a 24-hour period occurred on the 31st of May, 2009. What am I referring to, Jack?
I'd imagine it's Rafa losing at the French Open.
Yep, exactly, for the first time. Did you feel as though that was you at the time? To be honest with you, my memory is actually pretty vague, and it's more looking back because of what's happened since. Obviously, winning 14 times there and only ever losing 3 times. That this now becomes this epic, if you like, it gets bigger and bigger in terms of the landscape of tennis, of course, because we know what happened with Federer that year too.
Yeah, I mean, it's still, I think it still shocked a lot of people. Somebody winning 4 times in a row, right, is pretty rare at any tournament, at any slam. So for Rafa to go out to anybody before the final was still a massive deal. Like, I don't think you can understate the fact that, okay, now he's at the point where he's won 14 French Opens, but I think people still sort of revered him and thought of him as a kind of legend in his own right at that point, in his career, definitely. So it was a huge upset. And Federer has obviously talked about the pressure he felt going in or playing his match against Tommy Haas, of course.
Yeah, so I believe that 31st of May was a Sunday. This is obviously the 4th round. And so Rafa loses. Soderling was just redlining. I've watched the match, I think, in its entirety at least once since. And I've seen the highlights many times. And Soderling is just redlining. And by the way, even when redlining, most people can't beat Rafael Nadal in Paris, and yet he manages to do so. But the reason I say 24 hours, of course, Jack, and you did just touch upon it, is because, of course, what happens the next day as well. So now Federer will wake up the next morning going, oh, hello, things have opened up somewhat. A bit like perhaps at the US Open, again with Djokovic, albeit Djokovic didn't quite the same, or at the US Open as he has in Australia, but maybe like when Djokovic went out early on a couple of occasions in Australia. I just remember Zverev, for example, saying in New York a few years ago, saying, oh, Djokovic isn't here now. Now, I'm actually going to tell you, I do actually think I've got a chance, and he gets to the final and loses. But Yeah, and I imagine Federer felt the same. It must have been waking up on that Monday morning before playing Tommy Haas going, oh, here we go. And it brings a new pressure in itself, of course. And perhaps that showed. And I mean, I remember watching some of the highlights last night of this Tommy Haas 4th round match. And, you know, the first 2 sets, I think the commentator says something like, there's a weird feeling. It's just a weird atmosphere. Maybe, of course, we read into these things. We read their feelings. They're not, you know, they're not objective things. But given what happened the previous day, you highlighted as well, Jack, that quite possibly Federer himself felt a bit of pressure now, a very different kind of pressure going into that match. And he's 2 sets to love down, and he's 3-4 down in the second set. So this Rafa Nadal nemesis is gone. It's all opened up. A guy, Tommy Haas, who's a good player, but is not probably going to win a major. In fact, he never does win a major, doesn't get to a final either. Very good play, you know, but he's not somebody who you would imagine winning the French Open. It's 2 sets to love up. It's 3-4, and he's 30-40. I'll come to your thoughts, both of you, in a second on this match, but I'm just going to show this point because really it's at such a monumental moment in Federer's career that some have described the forehand that he's about to produce as the most important one of his career. So it's game 8. It's 3-4. Roger Federer is serving 30-40. If he loses this point, Tommy Haas is serving for the match. Second serve as well. Maybe not the best forehand of his life, but certainly the most important because, of course, that would end up meaning he saved the point and ends up going on to win the match in 5 sets. He ends up winning the next game. He breaks, wins the set, and actually from that moment onwards, it ends up being very comfortable. Federer himself bagels Tommy Haas in the, I think, in the next set, 6-love, and then 6-2. Haas almost just all his energy and all his confidence just disappears from the minute he gets broken in this game, and that's it, really. What are your thoughts on this match, Jack? First,
I loved it. I love it in its sort of place in the pantheon of Federer's French Open greatness, basically, and you know how historic it's become. It's such an important point, that one, and knowing all the context behind having to make a great second serve high to Haas's backhand and then making that forehand, and it's not far from the line, by the way. It's great. Love that sort of stuff. You know, just with all the context around it, it's such a great point. So it was a great match in general. I've seen quite a lot of it. The first 2 sets, he was so flat. It just looked like, as you say, there was a weird atmosphere. It's almost like, what is going on? Federer's got the best chance of his life, and he's coming out here looking completely second rate to well, relatively to him. So it's a great story. It's a great part of the story.
Any thoughts at this point, Nick?
Yeah. Just quickly, did you guys touch on the previous matches in his run before he got to Tommy Haas? I'm
more than happy to do so. Go on.
Well, I don't really remember, but like I'm looking at the score lines, it looks like even before the Haas match, and there's no doubt that the Nadal exit played a part, but even before the Haas match, it looked like Federer was dropping sets and looking a little vulnerable still. Like that Akasuso match, way closer than you would expect it to be, apart from the 4th set on the scoreline.
Absolutely.
Paul-Henri Mathieu, very good player, managed to take the first set off him. So he was probably looking a little bit out of sorts anyway, and Nadal going out clearly rattles him. But then again, that forehand woke him up because not only did he steamroll Haas, and I think I did watch that match. I don't remember counting Federer out of it though. Even though he looked it was a bit off. Like I never really counted him out of it, because those first 2 sets were pretty close. It's almost the kind of victory you kind of expect from Novak Djokovic now, almost in like places like Australia or Wimbledon, where even when he's 2 sets to love down, you still think, if he gets his foot in, he's going to win. Thinking like Tsitsipas in the French last year or Sinner at Wimbledon this year. But then after Haas, like he steamrolls Gael Monfils, who would be someone that he would, I think, either he would never lose to, or he'd lose to once. Vance just tweeted some stats around all that overnight around players who've never beaten Federer, and or
I
only got
saw
one.
that, yeah.
And then the Del Potro match again in the semis, that was, yeah, you just got like Del Potro was rattling him, but you just had the sense that Federer had this extra edge. So yeah,
This was before Del Potro
really.
This is before he'd won the US Open. This is before he was making Wimbledon semis and so on. So this is probably his breakthrough slam, perhaps, for Del Potro.
Yeah, to a certain extent. Yeah, he was certainly late 2008, 2009. He was definitely coming through. He was getting some interesting results. But yeah, this is the first Grand Slam semi-final, and he performs really well in that match against Federer. Del Potro had a way of rattling all of the big three, but particularly Federer. But again, it was one of those, like, I remember that again, that semi-final that Federer like Del Potro was playing incredibly well, and Federer still managed to turn the tables on him.
Yeah.
And I think that it was all very comeback wins this tournament.
Go on, Jack.
Yeah, I would just adding to what Nick said. It's like when Federer played Nadal the first 5 times, 05 to 08 and then 11, I believe. He wasn't dropping sets outside of playing Nadal. I think I just looking up there, he'd lost 7 sets, I believe, in those 5 appearances. And then in 2009, he drops 5 sets to other opponents, basically.
Yeah.
So outside of Nadal, I should add. So seven sets to any other opponent that's not Nadal, basically, in those 5 appearances, and then 5 sets to everybody else, basically. So it just shows you how much more pressure, I guess, or how much how rocky a tournament this was in general.
And I've got a broader point, or a few points. In fact, I did skip the first 3 rounds, but I did make some notes on them, having also watched some highlights from these matches yesterday too. He also mentions it, by the way, in his, I think it's his on-court interview after he wins the final. I hope we're not spoiling it for anyone here. He does go on to win it this year, and there we go. But I think it's on his on-court interview after he beats Soderling, and it's, talking about the relief and excitement and stuff. And he also mentions he said, how many times I've come close to going out in this tournament, And I'll mention some things. Obviously, the first round was fairly comfortable, but in that second round, he loses the first set, as you can see on the scoreboard there. He also faces a set point in the second set tie. He faces a set point in the third set. Tell a lie. He wins the first set, and but he does face a first set tie break, first set point, if you like, in that tie break. I think it actually is a bit of an epic tie break. It's like 10-8 or something like that, or 12-10. And he does save a set point, and he saves it because of a really bad error from his opponent. He ends up winning that first set, but loses the second set. And of course, as you can see on the scoreboard as well, very, very tight third set, ultimately prevails. Third round, of course, loses the first set, as we can see from here. And Nick highlighted what a handy player Mathieu was, and so on and so forth. We then have the epic against Tommy Haas that we've highlighted. Gael Monfils, strangely enough, ends up being one of the more comfortable matches for him, given the talents that obviously Monfils has. And then he's got this Del Potro semi-final, and he's in. You're right. I mean, Federer was obviously an amazing player, but he's still in all sorts of bother. 2-1 down, and being 2-0 down to Tommy Haas is one thing. Being 2-1 down at the semi-final stage to Del Potro, of course, is another. And just so close on so many occasions to not making it, but ultimately he did. Nick, you got something to say?
No, I don't.
Oh, sorry. You sort of, I just sort of saw a body language thing there that made me think you did. Okay, so he makes the final, finally, if you like, after this epic run, so to speak. Robin Soderling stands in his way. This is the guy who obviously knocked Rafa out a week before. And so a week later, also on a Sunday, also on Philippe Chatrier, Robin Soderling tries to climb Mount Everest again, if you like, albeit maybe it's more Kilimanjaro than Mount Everest, as he comes up against, the second best player in the world on clay. And there's no shame in that when Rafa Nadal is number one, if you like. What are my thoughts on this match? Well, it actually ends up being pretty comfortable on the scoreboard. at least. It's 6-1, 7-6. Obviously, things got a bit tight there, and then 6-4. Jack, have you got any thoughts on this final?
Oh, it was one of those ones that defines the big three, right? Because again, he could have went into that match feeling as much pressure as any of his other matches, but just they have an aura about them in finals. They have a sense of inevitability. This was definitely an inevitable result in so many ways, right? And for Federer to finish it in straight sets, so impressive, when really he should have been feeling the most pressure of his career.
Right. I mean, in terms of pressure, absolutely. But interestingly, because Soderling kind of did come from nowhere, you can see he's the 23 seed there, so he's not a complete nobody, but he's certainly not somebody you've ever thought of as being a major threat at a slam. I believe he got to the final again a year later when he lost to Rafa that year, when Rafa got his revenge. But he did sort of come from nowhere in that particular slam. And in fact, the commentator at the beginning of the match, or one of the commentators, said, after facing Rafa in the final so many times before for Roger Federer, of course, this year, though, it wasn't a case of deja vu, but more Robin who was the commentator's words as they went into that final, which I thought was quite amusing. But certainly in terms of Federer looking good, if you like, there was certainly deja vu feeling there, because he did manage to hold off that obviously weight of expectation that he would have had, and all the facts that he hadn't quite managed to do it before. I'm going to come to you in a second, Nick. We're just going to watch sort of the last minute of this. And the first thing I want to show is we can see Mirka there in the crowd. This is it's not match point, but it's deep into the third set as he's getting closer and closer to basically closing this out. I'll just play the last sort of minute or two of this little highlights reel before I come back to you in a second, Nick. So this is him trying to close it out.
Of course it's a deuce.
Mirka literally praying there. Love it.
We can see the emotion in his face there and what it must have meant to him. We saw the tension from Mirka in the crowd. I think she probably felt the tension maybe even more than her husband did at times. And any thoughts on this run, and obviously in particular the final and the final moments there, Nick?
Yeah, that was a really, really impressive performance from Roger in that final after coming through all the nerves. Yeah, as you both said, he just locked down and got the job done. And yes, Soderling did challenge him, and that was to be expected. I mean, I remember watching that at 15 years old and like, come on, he's got to get this. He's got to get this. And I was a little bit nervous about Soderling because I thought, well, if this guy can beat Rafa on clay, he could beat anyone on clay. So I was very relieved when the scoreline went very much Federer's way. That moment, I mean, like, even watching that back now, I was like, come on, get this.
Yeah.
I knew, even though I knew he did. That moment of like, yes, he's finally got a French Open. He's got the set. He's tied Sampras record because that was also on the line.
That's right.
He kind of, this was kind of like the last statistic that he needed to confirm his, at the time, GOAT status. Because we didn't know at that point, it was now starting to come out that Rafa was injured, and this was still a time when we weren't used to tennis players coming back quite the same from injury. Right. And so there was questions about that. Djokovic wasn't himself. Murray wasn't really making the strides that we were hoping he was. And so it just seemed to sort of cement this sort of status, and he put Federer back on top of the world. And yeah, it was great to see sort of, so as a Federer fan, emotionally, that will remain a significant moment. And I even more so for the man himself, quite clearly, because he wanted that French Open, not only because he kept on running into Rafa, but because he grew up on clay. He would have watched the French Open growing up. He wanted that title.
Yeah, absolutely. He was presented the trophy by Andre Agassi. Interestingly enough, of course, Andre Agassi's won 8 slams and on all surfaces too, something not even the great Pete Sampras managed to do. And I think that is a thing in tennis. I think you win the most majors, but I think if you win the most majors and you haven't done it on all 4 surfaces, or if you like, all 4 majors, I should say, and all 3 surfaces at the 4 majors, I think there is a gap in your CV, if you like. Not that there were many gaps at this point in Federer's CV, but perhaps this was it. So he finally sort of manages to close that door. And of course, not only you mentioned some points there. I mean, Djokovic was, I think, probably at this stage had only won 1 slam. That was the previous year's Australian Open. And so he was obviously a long way behind, 14-1. It would soon become 15-1. Federer would soon overtake the great Pete Sampras at the next month's Wimbledon, obviously when he gets his 15th, overtaking Pete's record that many people thought probably would never be broken. So just to show you there that records are there to be broken. Let's go back to the rest of the Federer narrative at the French Open. It's much shorter, despite being only halfway through his career, so to speak. He actually lost to Soderling the next year. In 2010, I mentioned how Soderling got to the final, playing Rafa, and en route, he beat Federer in 4 sets. I actually don't really have any memories of this match. Do you, Jack?
No, I don't actually. I mean, it needs to be noted, Soderling's an incredibly flat hitter, and as you say, his red line was good enough to beat Rafa. That's the takeaway. His red line's incredibly high. Like, the guy could have beat anybody if he was playing well enough, because he hit the ball nearly bigger than anybody else when he was playing his best. So he wasn't to be underrated. Obviously made 4 in the world. So
yeah. Nadal beating him in 2011 again, also in the final. It's probably, for me, I remember the series of finals that they had, and the gap obviously growing. I actually don't really have any memories of this match, either the Nadal match or the Soderling match from the year before. Have you got any thoughts on these 2 matches before we address the Djokovic match in 2012, Nick?
Soderling in 2010, I remember being crushingly disappointed, but not surprised, because, as you said, like when Soderling's red lines, he could be anybody. The Nadal final, I remember Federer putting up a decent fight, but it was by that point Nadal on Philippe Chatrier was just inevitable against everybody. And actually 2011 for me is more memorable for the semi-final Federer had, where he beat Djokovic, because Djokovic hadn't lost the match in 2011.
Oh, okay. That was 2011. Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, it was 2011. So he beat Djokovic in 4. So I thought you were going to talk about the loss in 2012.
Sorry,
but
yeah, you're right. I want to talk about that one. But let's as we're here, Nick, let's talk to me about this 2011 semi-final that he had against Djokovic.
Yeah, so I remember going into this thinking, again, Djokovic is going to win this. Djokovic has won every match this year. Everyone was talking about Djokovic was going to topple Rafa and win the French, because he'd beaten Rafa. He'd beaten Rafa in every match they played in Masters finals or semi-finals that year, in Indian Wells, Miami, and then on clay in Madrid and Rome, to win those titles. And everyone was like, okay, Djokovic can do this. And then Federer comes out in that semi-final and plays one of the best matches he's ever played to beat Djokovic in 4. I don't remember too much about how Djokovic was in that match, but Federer was just incredible that day. He did still drop a set. Djokovic made it competitive. But yeah, it's probably one of his most well-known performances. And that headline, Roger Federer shocks French Open by beating Novak Djokovic. Roger Federer beating Novak Djokovic shouldn't be a shock, but somehow it was.
Yeah. just because, as you
Yeah.
say, he was on such an incredible run. Jack, what are your thoughts on this match?
Yeah, it's probably one of the main takeaways for me, and it's the staple of the Federer legacy is that he could rock up in matches and serve out of his mind. I mean, I'm pretty sure that was one of the main reasons he was winning points so frequently in that match, because Djokovic was still able to put Federer into this sort of backhand lockdown, not in the same way as Rafa, of course. It wasn't so much an offensive shot, it was more of a neutral sort of cross-court rally that Federer would struggle to get out of, but he still played well. He barely missed on that side, I remember that. But the main thing was he was winning points off his first serve so easily, and it's why he was such a good clay courter, because there are other players that can't spot serve anywhere near as well as Federer. And obviously, it's such a slow court. It takes a really good serve to get it past nearly anybody, especially Rafa, of course, and especially Djokovic. So for Federer to beat either of those players on that surface, he had to serve so well, and he did in that match, and it's definitely the hallmark of his clay court career for me. I think it's more impressive because of the stage and because of the significance of Djokovic's run than his wins over Rafa in Madrid and Hamburg.
Yeah, as you say, a lot of people have sort of described this as his best ever performance, either on the surface or even at the French Open itself. Interesting, there's a little subheading there that Djokovic announced he was going to put out a Queen's to rest before Wimbledon this particular year, 2011. But it's great that despite it being the least successful major for me, or for him, obviously, at Roland Garros, it's possibly the one with the most narratives in a way. We've obviously got the Wimbledon 2008 final, but, you know, winning all the time there as he did for 5 years in a row, don't know if that's a narrative in itself, but there's so many ups and downs for him at the French Open, and it's actually the French Open and I think Australian Open are actually the two of the four that I was most looking forward to for the narratives, really, in terms of the reviews of this. So Nick and I are going to go through his Wimbledon record later, where he did pretty well. And I'm sure it's probably where Nick and I sort of first took note of him, but we'll address that this evening. So make sure you tune in for that. I think it'll be about 9 p.m. UK time and 10 p.m. Central European time this evening. So we'll look forward to that. In a way, this sort of 2011, 2012 was kind of the end of his French Open career in many respects. I mean, he does come back a year later. He's beaten by Djokovic in straight sets in the semi-final, so a very different result that particular year. He goes out to Joe Wilfred Tsonga in the quarterfinals in 2013. He goes out in the fourth round and he's shocked here by the 18th seed Gulbis, and he loses to Wawrinka in the quarterfinals in 2018. Have you got any memories of any of those matches or any of those years, Jack?
Yeah, I remember Tsonga beating him, but 2013 was such a spotty year for Federer. That wasn't so much of a shock. Gulbis, I mean, Gulbis, of course, a lot of people like to say is actually the GOAT of tennis. So, you know, you gotta give the guy some credit in all seriousness at the same time. It was definitely a shock, but I mean, Gulbis has actually got a great red line, like incredibly good server when he's playing well. So that, I don't know, I remember watching that match and thinking it wasn't that crazy. I'm sure he'd had a great result kind of recently as well, maybe against Novak. So, I mean, it wasn't too much of a shock. And then 2015, when Stan beat him, I mean, that was a great match. Stan so deserved to win. He is a better clay courter for me than Federer when he's playing his absolute best. It's just Stan doesn't always come out and play his absolute best, of course. But, I mean, Stan's red line is higher than probably anybody's, basically.
I guess he would have been wearing the shorts that year as well.
Yes,
I think.
The famous checkered shorts. Yeah, that was that year.
Which I think Djokovic makes fun of. It's really funny. Djokovic makes fun of him during one of those Instagram live videos that they all did a couple of years ago as the pandemic hit. And I think he's got a keyring or something, and it's on the keyring is the shorts that Wawrinka was wearing that day. Because, of course, Wawrinka, same sort of time, at least in the quarterfinal stage, Djokovic, of course, was beating Nadal and would go on to play Wawrinka in the final. And for me, it was a surprise to see Wawrinka win that day. And denying Djokovic the chance to do the calendar, or not the calendar slam, sorry, the career slam, which I think is also kind of significant in that Federer did it first amongst the three, and he did it 6 years before Djokovic managed to do it. It was just I think it was a year before Rafa did it. Rafa completed it in 2010 by winning the US Open. Nick, have you got any thoughts on these matches that we're just sort of skating over right now?
No, not more. I think my thoughts are the same as Jack's. Really, I think there was a definite sense that I think the French Open was now getting away from Federer. He probably wasn't going to win another one. He was always going to be a contender, but whilst Nadal and Djokovic were around, it was going to be tricky. And then obviously Stan putting himself on the map. We never had a Federer Murray clay court match. That's never happened.
Clay court match at all at any tournament.
They've never played on clay, so I would have loved to have seen that because that would have been fascinating. I don't know how that would have gone, but it depends on the location probably. But yeah, that never happened. But Murray at the French might have been been less of a challenge compared to those two.
I think
I was,
to be honest.
Sorry, what?
I think Roger would have won.
Yeah, I think so too. But yeah, the Gulbis one, even the Gulbis one, which is considered a shock. I mean, for me, Gulbis still got to the semi-finals, and like Jack said, his top level is amazing. It's just he finds that one time once every 1,000 matches.
By the way, this is an interesting point here from 12 Travel 21 regarding there was a few sort of stars aligning for Federer in 2009 as he won the tournament. And I have seen a really good thread from somebody, I think he's a member of the popcorn community. I know his picture on Twitter is him below what looks like a windowsill or something, and he's just looking above it. But I wish I could remember his name. I know Owen knows him. And he did a really good thread a long time ago, 6-7 years ago. I remember reading this thread, and it was all about the semi-final that Djokovic and Rafa played in Madrid. I mentioned how obviously Federer managed to beat Rafa on the Sunday in the final, but there have been stories, not concrete stories, if you like, not what's the word? I mean, he still went to Paris. Let's say Rafa, but there's obviously stories that 4-hour match where he sort of seemed to have some knee issues appearing. They seem to sort of reappear again in the final as obviously Federer wins the final in Madrid, and then perhaps were reappearing on the day that he lost to Soderling. These are all ifs, muts, and babies. That maybe they're not quite as concrete as some other injuries in his career, I would suggest. I dare say that there was something lingering at least. But sometimes injuries can be lingering. But for the 4 hours you're on court, if you like, it's not there. It's only afterwards that when the adrenaline is gone that you feel it. And of course, he did pull out of Wimbledon in 2009, and I'm not even sure if we saw him at the US Open either that year. So that's a good point from 12 Travel 21. Let's race through this because we're sort of running out of time. There's one or two other things happening today as well. So, of course, what happens is he doesn't appear at Roland Garros for the next few years. In fact, to be honest with you, I think we never thought we'd see him there again. He didn't play in 2016 due to a back injury, skipped the entire clay court season in 2017 and also in 2018. So it was somewhat of a surprise when he reappeared in 2019. I was at Roland Garros this particular day, but because of how Roland Garros do it as opposed to Wimbledon, they separate the two semi-finals in terms of tickets. I had a ticket for Dominic Thiem against Djokovic, which actually ended up going into a second day because of the rain. This is probably the last year they had before the roof at Roland Garros, so at Philippe Chatrier. So, he loses to Nadal in the semi-final, but it was fairly one-sided. It was that super windy match. I don't know if you remember that, Jack.
I remember it. Yeah, it was so windy. I remember watching it on my phone. It was great, actually. Just quite a good exhibition of why Rafa's such a great windy player. And Federer, I mean, he made the second set quite competitive. I'm pretty sure I remember, and it kind of looked like he might steal it, but he was never winning that match. Rafa was way better than him.
He was now rocking the beige, if I remember rightly. And of course, he'd switched sponsors, I think at the beginning of 2019, maybe, or end of 2018, switching to Uniqlo from obviously his sort of 20-year association with Nike was now at an end.
Some quite interesting stuff on that, I suppose, though, because I'm sure did he play any warm-up tournaments going into that?
I don't recall him playing anything. I think he just wanted some games and matches under his belt before playing Wimbledon, and because he's Roger Federer, that means he gets the semi-finals.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. He still got to the semi-finals and he beat Stan in the quarters, and it was a great match. I mean, again, Federer imposing his own game on a clay court and making it look like, you can serve and volley and stuff on that court and not get ripped to shreds by somebody like Stan. But somehow he made it work. And I remember one volley in particular in the third set tiebreak. I'm sure that Stan absolutely rips her forehand down the line, and somehow Federer gets a racket on it. One of those wonder shots that Federer hit. And he beat Ruud on the way as well, of course, to that semi-final. Before Ruud was quite the force he is now, of course, but still, Ruud on a clay court, you beat him 3-1 and a tiebreak. So
cool.
Yeah, he was still great.
Yeah, I mean, at least it's nice as well that Ruud got to play. I mean, we've seen this long list of players that are currently, I think, in the top 20 or so, or top 50 maybe, that have that unfortunately will never have the chance to play. Roger Federer, and of course, the main one being Carlos Alcaraz, never got to play. Federer, and a lot of people talk about the Alcaraz-Nadal comparisons, understandably so, but actually, he talks about Federer being his idol and talk about Federer being the person that he has modeled his game on most, especially in terms of the level of aggression that he shows with his shots. That 2019 semi-final, and also obviously the run that he had there. Yeah, I think, of course, by now, the knee injury, we didn't know it at the time, but the knee injury that ultimately finished his career was just at the beginning, if you like, of its 3-year, unfortunately, hampering, if you like. He talked about 3 years in his message that he gave last week to announce his retirement. And I thought maybe he was just being a bit loose with the timing on that, bearing in mind that I was aware of it for 2.5 years. But it does seem like it was even, because I know in an interview this week, Lubicic his coach mentioned how it was even an issue at Wimbledon that year in 2019. Obviously goes on to play Wimbledon, beats Nadal in the semi-finals there, and of course he loses to Djokovic in the final. We do have another little renaissance period though for him, where he reappears as well in 2021 as he's trying to sort of get back on the map, so to speak, of tennis, using again the French Open as a springboard for Wimbledon that year. What are your memories of his last ever French Open, Nick?
Yeah, it was clear that this was going to be the beginning of the end when he came back, because, how many more injuries can someone who's nearly 40 keep coming back from? I remember him doing really well. I can't remember his first 2 matches. But I can remember that the Daniel Kopfer match that ended up being his
on a Saturday night, I think.
The Saturday night, the French Open, ends up being his final French Open match before he pulled out against Berrettini, because I think he knew that if he went too deep in the tournament, he was going to compromise his chances at Wimbledon.
Yes. Good problem, Stan.
And he. Yeah, but that's the thing, is that like just that comeback, even though he wasn't quite warmed up yet, he was still playing quite well. He was still really competitive. All the losses he had.
I remember on the way to that match as well, pretty comfortable win against Cilic, which is
that's
good
right.
win.
I remember the Cilic match now. That was so good to see him beating Cilic. And okay, at the time we didn't think Cilic was the best clay court player, although his Roland Garros semi-final run this year has kind of put that to bed. But beating Cilic in that way, especially since Cilic did make it competitive, was really impressive, given he was still coming back. And then the Kopfer match was a really nice match, actually. Both guys played really well. Kopfer made it a real battle. And Federer put on one last show at Roland Garros, and I thought that was a good way to go out. Yes, people weren't happy that he pulled out of the rest of the tournament, and felt it was disrespectful. But hey, it's your career, it's your body. You know what the best thing for you is, and I think it was the right decision. Which means that the last time he actually lost a match at Roland Garros was against Rafael Nadal, which in many ways feels appropriate. Yeah, feels appropriate.
Yeah, right. And I remember thinking at the time when he pulled out the tournaments, thinking, I don't know, I wasn't sure if I felt super comfortable with it. I mean, I will give most players the benefit of the doubt, and certainly Federer even more so. But I think maybe looking back, bearing in mind what we know now, bearing in mind that he was obviously still feeling the injury, he would go on. And these are the last matches. We're talking about the last matches of his career right now. We're talking about, so he got to the fourth round. Was it Berrettini where he pulled out? Yeah, because Berrettini played Djokovic in the quarterfinals that year. So it was the fourth round he pulled out. So he has his 3 matches there. He'll then go on and have 4 matches at Wimbledon. Now, the last 7 matches of his career. Obviously, he's got maybe 1 or 2 more to come this coming weekend at the Laver Cup. But these are the dying embers of his career, and certainly at the French Open. And given that he was probably in some pain as well in that tournament, the French Open, we obviously know now that Wimbledon 2021, he gets to the quarterfinals there. Roger Federer on one leg can still get to the 4th round at the French and the quarterfinals at Wimbledon. Imagine how good he might have been if he had 2 legs. Anyway, yeah, so that was it. Any thoughts for you for Jack on his final French Open?
Yeah, I remember the Kopfer match really well. The one I did watch from start to finish, though, and maybe it goes under the radar, of course, because Esteman's not the greatest player, but we hadn't seen Federer play at the French Open for a wee while, a couple of years, I suppose, and it kind of felt like, obviously, he was on the way out, so we had no idea how he was going to play, and we'd just seen him lose to Andahar, of course, in Geneva, I believe.
That's right.
And he rocked up and played one of just a very vintage match. I remember thinking he almost looked like he was having fun out there. He was doing Federer stuff that we hadn't seen for a while, just almost toying with Esteman in a way. It was one of the first matches I'd seen him play on clay in a long time, so it was really great for me to watch. And actually, it's a really enjoyable match. It just basically felt like, as always, what I was saying earlier about him dropping so few sets to people not named Rafa Nadal at the French Open, that he can beat anybody in that surface if he wants to, basically, so long as they don't have a crazy lefty forehand, essentially. It's just so vintage and so testament to the guy that he can beat people when he's not playing his best.
As a Federer fan, Nick, I think it's probably fair that you should have the last word on Roger Federer at the French Open. What are your thoughts? You can repeat what you said earlier. It's fine. Just give us your final thoughts on Federer at the French.
I think it's a testament to how good Federer is that we've gone through a lot of his history, and since he started winning, since he decided, since from 2005 onwards, he never went out before the 4th round. He always made it the 2nd week. Generally, when he was on, the only people who could beat him were Nadal and Djokovic. Or someone who we regard as a very, very good clay court player on their day, like a Wawrinka or a Soderling or a Zonga, who are also players who, well, Zonga also was a bit of a thorn in his side over the course of his career. Federer, we often get obsessed with the top of the mountain, the peak of the mountain, and that is Rafa on clay. And it makes us lose sight of how good Roger Federer was on clay. And yes, it seems ridiculous that he's only got 1 French Open. Frankly, it seems ridiculous that Novak Djokovic only has 2. But you can't, in the end of the day, we've spent a lot of this talking about Rafa, inevitably, because of the relationship to Roger and the relationship between Rafa and Roland Garros, because, you can't talk about Roland Garros without talking about Rafael Nadal. But Roger Federer on clay at Roland Garros was one of the best players ever to have played there. And I can say that, and I don't think even people who aren't as hardcore Federer, I think people who aren't as hardcore Federer fans as me would say the same thing. His clay court game was great. And he could still produce magic on that surface, even if we do see it as his weakest one, because he hasn't statistically got the titles in comparison to other surfaces.
In terms of the warmth, of course, that he's received by fans such as yourself, Nick, around the world as well, Paris is no different. The early years against Rafa, I'm watching those finals, they're more on his side. And with each year that he loses to Rafa in the final, the crowd's volume seems to go up a little bit more in the support for him. That they were when he won those sort of 3rd sets against Rafa, or won the 2nd set against Rafa, whatever it happens to be, and gave himself a slight chance. The crowd are really supporting him, and by 2009, boy oh boy, poor Soderling, they're just, Soderling, they even gave him a standing ovation as he walks onto the court to play that final against Soderling. The Paris crowd.
Right.
Which tells you this is before the matches even start. I mean, we talk about some opponents and players that get booed when they go on. I'm not sure how you'd feel about your opponent getting a standing ovation before the match. So they were really going crazy for him. Of course, he's multilingual as well, so that helps warm him a bit to the French crowd. I know Djokovic, obviously, also being a French speaker too, obviously helps. But yeah, Rafa, by the way, he sort of does a few words in French, and I remember watching his speech live actually in 2018, and he sort of begins in French and then just says, "Oh, I'll switch to English if you don't mind." But now Rafa gets the love there, by the way. After 14 titles, he gets the love there. But it took him a bit longer than it did Roger, that's for sure. Listen, guys, thanks very much for you both being on board today. And I'll be back again with Nick this evening to talk about Wimbledon. Jack, I'll be with you tomorrow to talk about the US Open in the morning. And Roger Federer week is getting underway. Listen, guys, thanks very much for stopping by.
No problem, John. Thanks very much.
Same to you, Tennis World. Thanks for stopping by, and have a good day, everybody.